let me introduce the moderator of our first panel. Erica Licht is our Research Projects Director. She has been engaged in racial equity and organizational change for over 15 years. She is a Fulbright Scholar and holds a Master's in Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School and a Master's in Justice Policy from the London School of Economics, where she was a Maguire Fellow. It is my pleasure to welcome our panel and to hand it over to you, Erica. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khalil. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here with you, Khalil, with our team at IARA, and with an audience of over 400 people joining from across the country, across the world. And I'm so grateful to be in this conversation with our esteemed panelists, who you will hear a little bit more about in a moment. So listen, Khalil has already established for us all this great retreat from truth-telling, from Black studies, from DEI programs, from racial justice, from racial equity. And just to double down on a few key places, I want to build our illustration a little bit more as we think about this opening plenary panel this afternoon. The Chronicle of Higher Education, and we'll have a grateful opportunity to hear more from an editor there, has tracked changes of over 203 college campuses in 31 states. This great retreat includes resource cancellations of diversity, equity, inclusion programs, office closures, staff firings. Any initiative or program in a university, a company, business called racial justice or diversity. We're talking about higher education, nonprofits, philanthropy, corporate and private sector. This list is non-exhaustive. Bud Light, Disney, Nike, organizations and companies have not just walked back on commitments to racial equity and DEI, but are gutting and banning programs themselves left and right the past year and the past few years. And so this attack on DEI also limits our ability to describe the conditions in the very first place that we experience in the workplace, campus, and society. People are saying, don't say the E word, equity. So we have four esteemed leaders here with us to really help us make sense of what's happening. They're going to help us understand the anti-DEI playbook, as well as what we might call the DEI playbook, or DEI. They're going to show us some of their efforts to track the waves of backlash and anti-DEI legislation, explore the lawsuits that are shutting down programs and companies, and most of all, give us a sense of what should we be learning from these tactics and how can we push back on the pushback. We have so much to learn today, myself included, and so I'm thrilled to welcome our four guests. I will read brief bios for them, and I encourage you to read their full biographies at our conference webpage, which my colleagues have dropped in the chat. We have joining us Ayana Parsons, who co-founded the Fearless Fund, the first venture capital fund created for women of color by women of color. She is an extraordinary entrepreneur, visionary executive, and charismatic speaker, and held a range of influential roles across a number of companies and organizations. Shaun Harper is a provost professor in the Price School of Public Policy, the Rossier School of Education, and Marshall School of Business at the University of Southern California, and founder and executive director of the USC Race and Equity Center. He's published 12 books and over 100 academic papers, and a range of other accolades. John Palfrey is a well-respected educator, author, and legal scholar and innovator with expertise in how new media is changing learning and education. He serves as the president of the MacArthur Foundation and on the board of the Fidelity Nonprofit Management Foundation, along with a number of other board roles. And last, but certainly not least, we have joining us Katie Parsons, Katherine Parsons, Mangan, I'm sorry, who's joining us from the Chronicle of Higher Education. So Katie Mangan, not Parsons, covers a variety of issues, including campus diversity, student life, success, and college completion. And in her 38 years at the Chronicle, she has written extensively about student activism, sexual harassment, as well as a range of different interest areas. Well, without further ado, we've heard about these four esteemed folks, and I want to dive right in. Speaking of Katie, I'd love for you to kick us off and get us started. So, as we begin this conversation today, can you help give us an even clearer picture of the landscape of this attack on DEI, especially in higher education? We know that you and your colleagues at the Chronicle have been tracking this. Many of us here on this panel and in this room have been following your websites and efforts to stay attuned ourselves. So, over to you to give us a sense of the trends that you've been seeing and tracking.
Thanks, Erica. It's a pleasure to be here. At the Chronicle of Higher Education, we began tracking anti-DEI legislation back in January 2023 after reporting on a barrage of bills that were taking aim at four key areas of college diversity efforts. Conservative lawmakers in a growing number of states were taking aim at freestanding diversity offices, mandatory diversity training, the use of diversity statements in hiring, and the consideration of race or sex in admissions or employment. And the reason these four kept coming up is that they were identified in model state legislation proposed by the conservative Goldwater and Manhattan Institutes. And so far at the Chronicle, we've tracked 86 bills in 28 states and the US Congress. Since 2023, 14 of those have received final legislative approval, 14 of the bills have become law, and 54 have been either tabled or failed to pass or vetoed. A lot of others remain pending. Critics have argued that these practices are ineffective. They say they're a waste of taxpayer money. They promote liberal orthodoxy. Proponents, of course, counter that they're needed to create more equitable and inclusive environments for diverse students and employees, and to make up for decades of discriminatory practices. DEI offices began appearing on campuses well over a decade ago, but they expanded significantly after events culminating in George Floyd's murder in 2020. But as many predicted, just a few years later came the backlash. On that note, the Chronicle has also been tracking how the new anti-DEI laws and mounting political pressure have reshaped campuses. So far, we've logged changes at 203 public campuses in 31 states. In some extreme examples, entire DEI offices have been eliminated and dozens laid off in Texas and Florida. On many campuses, DEI offices have been renamed Offices of Belonging or Inclusion, with a mission to serve all students. Multicultural centers have closed, employee affinity groups have been banned, LGBTQ services discontinued. And just a few specific examples we've reported on recently, a minor in LGBTQ studies was scrapped at Texas A&M after a lawmaker complained. And at Indiana University, they created a system for students to file complaints about any faculty member or lecturer, or any employee who they think has not, quote unquote, fostered a culture of free inquiry, free expression, and intellectual diversity. In some cases where diversity offices were closed, students were told they could continue to run their own support groups and clubs, but without any staff support or funds, which of course has made that challenging. Colleges have been accused of overcorrecting, eliminating programs and positions that weren't even spelled out in the legislation. When I attended a meeting a while back of the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, people were advised to familiarize themselves as much as possible about what the laws do and don't do so that they could push back on that kind of overreach. I've also written about how DEI officers are being encouraged to collect and share data that show why their efforts are needed and where they're working. So that's just a brief overview of an important topic that we're going to continue to be following at the Chronicle in the coming year as DEI offices evolve to meet the challenges they're facing and as colleges deal with the fallout from all of these attacks.
Thank you so much, Katie. That's incredibly helpful for painting this picture for us. And I know, as I mentioned earlier, that this tracking specifically in the tools that you and your colleagues have offered are so useful and critical for us in the field. It's a great segue, Shaun, to your work. You are leading a team that's been responding in real time to the attacks that Katie's just described. And that's in the nonprofit as well as private sector and higher education, where you and the center you direct are located. So give us a sense, and especially some more kind of nuance of how these attacks are playing out and functioning within higher education, where you are, and within the organizations that you're working with. And what advice in real time are you giving to institutional leaders around these issues? So what are you seeing in the attacks and how are you responding?
Sure. Well, Erica, let me start by thanking you, Khalil, and your colleagues for convening us and for inviting me to be a part of this really important conversation. Honestly, I think you and Khalil did an amazing job of actually framing what is happening in K-12 schools, higher ed institutions, and in corporate context. What we're seeing are stunning, horrifying reversals of espoused commitments to racial justice, racial equity, and DEI more broadly. I so appreciate the trackers that Education Week, as well as the Chronicle, have made public, right? They've gifted to us these legislative trackers, which I think is so noteworthy. Beyond the trackers, though, what we're also seeing is that many companies and institutions are very quietly, not in a splashy headline grabbing way, but quietly renaming their DEI offices, eliminating the DEI professional roles, and so on, right? So, for the things that we know publicly, I guarantee you there are millions more examples of these kinds of reversals and walkbacks. Look, I've been a professor for 23 years, and the center that I founded is now almost 14 years old. What we're doing here is what we've always done. We are sticking to our work and doing it with rigor, with evidence, and with integrity in a way that aims to bring people together, not divide them. One example of that is there was a ridiculous legislative hearing on March 7th that just overflowed with all sorts of misinformation and disinformation about DEI efforts on college and university campuses. As I watched that legislative hearing, it became really clear to me that the response needed to be an evidence-based one. So that same day, I commissioned evidence-based responses from a dozen leading higher ed scholars. 7 days later, we published a report titled Truths About DEI on College Campuses. And they're all evidence-based responses to the misinformation. That report we printed and mailed 10,000 hard copies, and it since has been downloaded by nearly 2 million people from our center's website. So, we're harnessing evidence. So my advice to many organizations is to respond with evidence. Show your work. Show people what you're doing in the name of DEI to prove that it's not the ridiculousness that Christopher Rufo and others are recklessly claiming that all DEI efforts are. Those are just a couple examples. I'll give one more. It's the thing that I think excites me most right now. We have put together what we're calling the National DEI Defense Commission. And it is a commission that is a collection of tables. There's one table that has 100 scholars and researchers who are all DEI experts in higher education. There's a separate table for chief diversity officers and DEI professionals on college campuses, 100 of them. My favorite table that we're putting together is a table that will have hopefully more than 1 million college students all across the country. And ultimately, we're attempting to ignite a movement that is, again, evidence-based, but more importantly, that is in defense of our democracy. It is uniting people who know better and who really care about our democracy to fight back and collectively clap back against these attacks on it.
Wow, that's right. Thank you, Shaun. I'm clapping for your clap back right now. Thank you so much for illustrating and just shedding light on the developments you're seeing and this resource. I'm thrilled to hear about it. Really excited to hear more, and hopefully we'll have time to circle back to some of the things that you've shared with us already. One of the things you touched on, Shaun, that's a beautiful segue to my question for Ayana, is this movement of pushing back on the pushback, right? Like, we are all a part of, in our various sectors, a movement to push back, and we're responding to that movement of pushback on DI itself, as in, these are not isolated cases of removing offices, creating legislation. This is coordinated, this is widespread. So, Ayana, you and colleagues were in the news a lot this past year, and many of us were quite struck wholeheartedly by the outright onslaught on the Fearless Fund, which you co-founded. This was an attack on a program explicitly serving Black women entrepreneurs and using litigation. So, what do we need to learn from this case? What happened to the Fearless Fund? How does that help illustrate for us these larger dynamics of this anti-DEI movement?
Well, Erica, thank you for the question, and certainly thank you for having me, and thank Khalil as well. I'll start by sort of taking a step back, because this has absolutely been a domino effect, and both Katie and Shaun alluded to what's happening in the higher ed landscape. Well, the same individual who got affirmative action overturned in higher ed, his name is Ed Blum, was the same individual who attacked the Fearless Fund. He's also the same individual that got some California board diversity legislation overturned. So it is a concerted attack. It is a well-funded attack. And he is trying to eliminate any race-conscious decision-making in America. And we certainly knew that education was not immune, and business is not immune as well. What I'll call out about the Fearless Fund case that I thought was also pretty ridiculous is that they used Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Well, this was the same act that was created to protect formerly enslaved people from economic exclusion when it came to contracts. So the irony of this case is, so many years later, where we're trying to provide opportunities for, in this instance, Black women, again, who have been economically excluded, we faced litigation. The other thing that I will just sort of say about this is the Fearless Fund is a for-profit venture capital fund. That is what I co-founded. There's also a sister organization that is a foundation that was giving grants that I had no part in, but Ed Blum sued all of the entities. These grants were for women who needed them the most. I'll just back up a little bit as well and give some statistics. When we look at the funding landscape, and this is some 2022 data, more than $288 billion was deployed in venture capital funding in 2022. Of that 288 billion, 0.39% went to women of color, and 0.13% went to Black women. So when we take that step back and we really look at the American landscape and equity, we know that women of color are more than 20% of the US population quite easily, yet are receiving 0.39%. That's why this work is so important, because these women are starting businesses at a faster rate than any other demographic. So it's just, it's disheartening, but what I will tell you is, we weren't doing anything illegal. And what I will also say is, where Ed Blum was successful, and where I think what he has tried to do is instill fear. There have been so many organizations that have dismantled programs, that have pulled back funding for fear of being sued, because certainly no one wants to be hit with a federal lawsuit. But there is a clear distinction between what is legal and what is illegal, and certainly having programs that help those that have been marginalized, overlooked, underrepresented for not only decades, but centuries, is not illegal work. So that's what I will say, about the Fearless Fund, but happy to, answer any other questions, Erica.
Thank you. So John, before I move to you, I just want to follow up, Ayana, quickly on the fear mongering that you just spoke to. Can you lean a little bit more into that? I mean, give us a sense of what that's looked like in real time for you and other leaders like yourself, both in private sector at large.
Sure. Well, it certainly mirrors corporate America, but the reason why we were very specific that we were for women of color is because these are the women, and these are the people who have been the most disenfranchised. And so you now have a lot of organizations, whether it's venture capital funds or whether it's, corporate America and DEI programs that are not targeting a specific demographic. And I believe when you don't target a specific demographic and get to the heart of the issue, how do you solve the problems? And so now you're seeing a lot of language, around inclusion of all. And what we firmly believe, and I still believe, is that when you solve for the most disenfranchised, the most marginalized, that absolutely rises all tides, that rises all boats, that helps all people. But unless and until we have very specific programs that solve very specific problems, like the lack of access to capital for women of color and specifically Black women, then we can't meet them where they are, and we can't meet the needs. So that's what I would just tell you broadly is happening. You're hearing DEI programs that are for all. Language is being removed around programs being for Black people or programs being for women. That's what we're seeing on a large scale.
Thank you for sharing. And that fear is really palpable. As I turn to you, John, when I say fear, that implies retreating, retreating back. So in philanthropy, as a major leader and at MacArthur Foundation, I think we all want to hear about, what does effective leadership look like right now in this moment, in not retreating, not treading back, but holding the line. So we know that the same litigation tactics, as Ayana mentioned, are being used in and against philanthropy. So give us a sense of how, especially large philanthropies, and like a leader yourself, how are you standing your ground in commitments to racial equity in this moment?
Erica, thank you for framing it so well. And the short answer is we must, we are, we will, and I'll say a little more about each of those things. But just stepping back, it was a bombshell for me to hear that Professor Muhammad is leaving Harvard University for Princeton. That was news to me a few minutes ago. As a Harvard graduate and occasional visiting professor, I'm very sorry to hear it, I have to say, but really credit the work that he has done, that your team has done, and good for Princeton. I'm happy to say more on that another time, but in any event, that's quite extraordinary. And to each of you who are on this panel and the 400 plus who have joined, I'm glad to be in solidarity with you in this pushback. I think we each have important roles to play, and as a white man of enormous privilege and leading a big foundation, I think there's a particular role that I can play and seek to do along the lines, Erica, you suggested, which is, as there is pushback on our work, making clear that we are staying the course. For MacArthur Foundation, racial equity is a part of every program that we have. We are very clear that we continue to pursue it. We continue to say it is lawful, which it is, by the way. I would say, just to build on Ayana's extraordinary comments, and major kudos to her for being such a hero or shiro during this period and standing so strong. As she described what the effects of disinvestment, I think that's the job of philanthropy, is to address things like that. So take Chicago. I'm here on the unceded land of the Potawatomi in Chicago, and there's an extraordinary disparity in the south and west side of Chicago and the north and other parts of the city. About a 30-year life expectancy difference between where I am right now, if a baby is born in Streeterville nearby, compared to Englewood on the south side. That's an extraordinary injustice that we can and should address. And one way to do that is to direct more funding from a philanthropy to the Black and Brown communities on the south and west sides, where Professor Muhammad was born or raised, and to do less in my neighborhood. That, it seems to me, not only totally lawful, but necessary, and we're keeping doing it. And there are lots of ways we can and should. And I will go on in many respects. I appreciate Shaun Harper put a great piece, I think, in Forbes or Fortune. It's in the chat. It's a wonderful guide, I think, to philanthropies, which I think every philanthropy should follow. That's a great roadmap. I'd say at MacArthur, we are continuing to do our work as we have. I don't think there's a single grant we didn't make this year because of a change. I think it's important also, I'm a lawyer. I don't think the law has changed for philanthropies. So, I think it's very important to recognize, sure, the Supreme Court said some things about admissions in higher ed. It's a specific ruling. We have to comply. I get that, but that didn't say philanthropies can't do racial justice work. It just didn't. And if I leave with two words that I think we should avoid, it's anticipatory compliance. I think too many people across these sectors, including my own philanthropy, are starting to figure out ways to comply with a ruling or a decision or a something that doesn't exist. It might come. Ayana said we didn't do anything unlawful. Like, it may come that something is declared unlawful in a certain way, but we should not stop doing what we're doing that's right in the world before that's so. That's how authoritarians win. That's how people who are threatening you, that's how bullies work, right? We absolutely should not be in anticipation complying with something that doesn't exist. And I think that's too much of what we see in this moment of backlash.
Thanks, Shaun. If I could, press a bit further in what you're sharing with us, especially as a lawyer yourself, but also I imagine, like a lot of people in the room are a part of or leading organizations where there's fear, whether imagined and or real, but of actual litigation, right? And so I'm curious, especially both for a large foundation, but also medium and especially smaller sized foundations or nonprofits. What advice are you hearing lawyers give right now to these leaders to prepare for litigation, minimize the likelihood? I mean, I hear what you're saying in that those of us here know, in fact, the real reading and accurate reading of the law itself. But as we know, there's a lot of information and litigation out there saying otherwise. So what are you as a lawyer, and I guess to what extent have you discussed with other lawyers about how we should be interpreting these various lawsuits, and essentially what advice is being given to leaders right now?
Yeah, I mean, as a lawyer and as an occasional law professor, I'm saying read the law and actually take it seriously. The Fearless Fund case settled. It did not result in a ruling on a specific topic. It has not changed the world that Ayana works in because it was a settlement of that sort. The specific ruling in SFFA, it speaks to certain higher ed organizations. It does not speak to other higher ed institutions. It doesn't speak certainly to philanthropy and so forth. So I think part of it is actually just read the law. Yes, is there risk in the world of doing anything in our work? Of course there is, but that's true of crossing the street. I think partly what lawyers need to be able to do is to describe whatever the risks are and figure out what are the risks we have to take. My view, as somebody who believes, I think, in the kind of multiracial democracy that all of you are driving toward in your center, is we must take these decisions. It's a greater risk not to do it. To just take my example of, if we invest more in the north side of Chicago that's predominantly white and Asian and wealthy, and we do less in the south and west sides, which, by the way, is what we've done historically as philanthropies, and we don't do it with large general operating support over multi-years, we're taking a big risk for our society. That's a different kind of risk that we've taken in the past. So I think part of it is a lawyer really carefully understanding what the law actually says and helping boards and helping leaders and helping activists and whomever else make reasonable choices about the decisions we're making. And all I'm saying is, don't comply with something that might happen later on and take off the table the tools that we have right now and can continue to use. That's my pushback to the lawyers and the boards and other places that I'm invited to speak in front of.
Thank you. Shaun, I saw your hand. Yep.
Yeah, can I jump in quickly? I'm so inspired by what John just said. It reminds me, the day after the Supreme Court ruling on race-conscious admission, we hosted a live virtual event here in our center. 3,167 people attended from 48 states and 9 countries around the world. And I said to them exactly what John just said. You have to read the ruling. And, I cautioned them against interpretive overreach. It's really important, right? And 2 Saturdays ago, I double clicked on that same message in a keynote address at the National Association for College Admission Counseling. And, I think that we have to continue to push our colleagues, not just in admissions, but also in programming and in policymaking arenas, to actually read and follow the letter of the law and not engage in this sort of anticipatory interpretation, as John said. One other thing that I'll say quickly, and it's advice that I'm giving to corporate leaders that seems to be sticking. Look, I and we at the center don't engage in fear-mongering, but we do use evidence to help people understand what's at stake for our democracy, its educational institutions, and its workplaces. One of those consequences that I'm putting in front of corporate executives is the cost of lawsuits and settlements for sexual harassment, gender discrimination, racial harassment and abuse, so on and so forth. The money that they are going to have to pay out, in future years far exceeds the very, very, very tiny, unacceptably low DEI budgets that they are cutting, right? So that seems to be at least one argument that many corporate leaders are persuaded by in my work with them.
And Shaun,
Yeah.
Erica, also, if I could just add to that, Shaun, I think that point is an excellent one. I think, though, it partially takes us back to, though, some of the behavioral inclusion, which is why you have so much, unconscious bias training to begin with, because corporations want to comply. They don't want to be hit with these lawsuits, and we need that. But what we also need is the structural inclusion and these systemic barriers to be removed in corporations. And what I do fear is that in this anti-DEI movement, we go back to, more of the policies that just weren't working in the first place. That's why we have so few Black leaders that are running companies. That's why we have, and in the last, I'd say 3-4 years, because in another world, I was also an executive recruiter placing diverse leaders onto boards. We had more Black executives joining for-profit and publicly traded boards than we ever have, and we're seeing the reversal of that. And so I just think, in addition to the behavioral piece and making sure that these corporations comply and aren't hit with these lawsuits, we also need to be making sure that corporations continue to have their feet held to the fire by their employees, because I think those are the ones that are going to be able to do it around removing these structural barriers that are precluding them from making progress that needs to be made.
Yeah, Ayana, I completely agree with you. Seriously, mine is not at all a defensive response. What you're saying is exactly how we do our work here at the center. Is structural and systemic and policy change for us, for sure. And listen, for years and years and years, I've been telling folks in K-12, higher ed, and corporate context that a one-time implicit bias workshop ain't it, right? It has to be a much more rigorous, multi-dimensional approach to sort of curriculum within these workplaces. It cannot be a one-time sort of compliance-driven sexual harassment or implicit bias kind of training. Spot on.
Yeah. And I'm hearing this accountability piece, I don't know if you use that exact word, Ayana, or a euphemism, holding the feet to the fire. That was what you said. IARA's mission statement, so to speak, with accountability in our title is to explore that very notion of, what base are you accountable to, whether it's your employees, your internal staff, community, especially Black, Indigenous communities of color that are constituents, stakeholders. So this question of, how do you know when you have committed to the work of DEI, how do you know if it's matching up to your purported, goals in the first place? So really appreciate hearing some of the nuance there that both Shaun, you and Ayana have shared. So I want to pivot a little bit, and to the audience, I'm just checking with you. We are so excited you're here in this conversation. We want to hear your questions. So some of you have already dropped some fantastic questions in the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. So please keep them coming, and I will turn to them in just a moment. So there was a piece in the New York Times just today, and Khalil mentioned there was somehow a barrage of pieces in the last 48 hours. This one was exploring the University of Michigan, which is, as the author describes, one of the largest DEI commitments made at the University of Michigan of any large public university. And it, describes a series of events over the last decade where the report learned from many people, including Black students and faculty, that the interviewees were not giving much credence to the work that the university had done on DEI. And essentially what we're seeing in this reporting and other examples is in response to an increased skepticism of DEI in and of itself because of, reporting such as this. So I'm curious how this reporting squares with what we've been talking about in terms of what we're seeing in DEI programming at universities, whether USC or otherwise, in terms of, I would say, skepticism of the efficacy of these programs from within, but also of a readership that's following along a lot of forms of information right now on the national level in reporting from the New York Times and other big sources. Shaun, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll start. So I haven't seen the New York Times article about Michigan. I look forward to seeing that. I was engaging our Truths About DEI on College Campuses report because Burgess Owens, who is a congressperson from Utah, very recklessly lifted up the University of Michigan as an example of so-called DEI bloat in that March 7th congressional hearing. In the report, I used it as an example. So Owens maintained that the University of Michigan spent $30 million on DEI staff and programming. First off, that was very much like inclusive of a dumpster of just like all sorts of stuff that were not part of the university's sort of central DEI apparatus. There's that. But also, I think for context, the University of Michigan's 2024 fiscal year budget was just over $13.4 billion. If the $30 million is in fact accurate, let's say, for instance, that everything that Burgess Owens sort of labels DEI is in fact part of the $30 million, right? That's 0.2% of the entire University of Michigan budget, 0.2% for faculty, staff, and students who make that university diverse. I would argue that the citizens of Michigan and indeed our nation deserves more investment, not less, in DEI programming at the university.
Shaun, if I can jump in here too, I did a pretty extensive piece too about the University of Michigan. And it was, when people talk about this DEI bureaucracy, so many of the positions they mentioned were people who have a portfolio of so many things, and DEI might be just one tiny portion of it. So I think that's part of the sort of distortions and misinformation that goes out when people talk about a DEI bureaucracy.
Absolutely. And I'm, taking this question in part from the chat where Gary invited us to consider the very distortion that you just mentioned, Katie. So appreciate your point on that. Another news development in the last 48 hours, 49 House members led by U.S. Representative Robert Garcia of California shared their views in a letter to leaders of Fortune 1000. And Garcia, in his letter frames this as inclusion is a core American value and a great business practice. By embracing this value, you create safer and fair workplaces without sacrificing quality of financial success. So this is one way in which we're seeing in real time, again, strategies. Those of us in the room right now listening, I think folks they're hungry for what we're hearing from you all, which is we're in it. As Shaun, you said something kind of earlier, like we are still in it, in business as usual, doing this work and this critical work at that. So I think folks here are hungry for that affirmation, but also for some strategies, right, that they can take back in the various contexts within which they're working. And so I cite this, letter from the congressional members as an example of such a move, in the policy space. I'm curious, and then I'm going to turn to audience questions. If there's any other examples that you all want to cite, either from your own organizational work or others that you're seeing of strategies in real time to, again, either advocate for these efforts and maybe in creative framings or, again, toe the line and push back directly on the pushback.
Erica, go ahead, Ayana.
Go ahead, Katie. No,
I was just going to say, when I got back from the NATAHE meeting where DEI officers were talking about strategies, I sort of summarized some of what they were telling me. They were saying, choose your words carefully, avoid acronyms. You don't have to start about talking about DEI. Talk about what DEI represents, what it really means on your campus, so that you don't automatically turn people off who have this sort of preconception about DEI. Surround yourself with allies who can help get the work done when there's a target on your back. Sometimes there are other people who are better positioned to be able to advocate for these things than you, if you're a DEI officer who feels very much that you are, have a target on your back. Keep up with proposed legislation. Again, know what it says and what it doesn't say, so that when there's overreach, you can call them on it. And fortify your data. And above all, keep yourself physically and emotionally healthy, because it's just a really challenging time ahead for everybody. So that was some of the advice that NATAHE participants were getting.
I love that, Katie. I don't know that I have anything profound to add, but I will say what comes to mind for me is just this constant reminder of how important representation is. And I would just say, for anyone in the audience, if you are a decision maker in your organization and you have the ability to hire and to develop, think about the talent that you are fostering and nurturing in your organizations, because the more we can have inclusive leaders at the helm of these organizations, the more we can drive change. And so that representation in occupying spaces where, people don't look like you, that has been a tenet of my entire career. And I think that's how we drive change, having more folks doing that.
That's right. Thank you. John, did you want to jump in?
I'll just, I want to highlight something that Ayana said earlier that I thought was really, really great. So both in educational sectors and in corporate sectors, there are employees, right? And I think that those organizations ought to be certainly accountable to their students and constituents, but also to their employees. So one piece of advice that I've been giving to employees is to not go it alone, but instead to engage with others and build these coalitions so that folks can speak in a unified voice and not put their individual careers at risk. But when you have a collective of people sort of speaking back, they just have so much more power, right? So that's just one other piece of advice.
That's great. Really appreciate that. John, did you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, it's been so well said by others, but I will just amplify one bit that I think builds on Ayana's point about representation. I think representation also links to the ability to hire diverse and effective and creative teams. So I think about the MacArthur Fellows Program. We really support a very broad array of diverse people, in part because there's talent that hasn't been recognized in the past in lots of fields. And that's one of the things that we try to do. I think about, many of you may know John Rogers from Ariel Investments. He emphasizes this idea of business diversity. Across everything we do, we have not been hiring diverse firms that do great accounting work or great legal work or great comms work or other things. We tend to hire diverse groups that maybe serve food at our organization, things like that. We have left on the table incredible talent. Investment managers be another example. I believe that we are going to get better results. There are lots of other reasons to do the DEI work, but one of them is just function. And we're going to attract more diverse, effective teams. People are going to thrive better in the organizations. They're going to do better work. We're going to achieve our missions better. They're just really simple business reasons to do this work. And somehow when we get caught around the axle on the political topics, we lose sight of the fact that this is just going to be good business. Fearless Fund is going to return great returns because these are women who have great ideas that have been overlooked. It's just going to happen. And that's exactly, I think, at the core of what we should be driving toward.
So these have been some fantastic points. And just to dig in a little bit more actually on this topic with a question from the audience on demonstrating effectiveness and the person wrote efficiency, but I'd say my interpretation be, you know, how do you demonstrate this work, you know, continue to do so? And is there, are there any specific tools, whether it's data, we're hearing about some strategy, to demonstrate whether, I guess it's the success or impact of the word and or its necessity?
I mean, I'll jump in. I mean, I think we measure what matters. And so I think, you know, I've heard Shaun use, you know, sort of the evidence-based, you know, research, but I think we've got to have evidence-based results. And one of the things I'm very proud of, now it took us 4 years to do it, but for the fund, we produced our first social impact report in 2023. And coincidentally, it launched right before the lawsuit was filed. And that is where we talked about the impact of being able to invest in Fund One, $26 million in approximately 40 companies. And we talked about the impact of those investments because those women-led companies were able to transform their communities. They hired diverse employees. And you know, when you do that, that helps families, communities, the work that they were doing with the products and services that they brought to market, how that was sort of making the world a better place. But I think it is having an intentional focus on, yes, we're doing the work, but we're also going to be measuring the impact of the work. And it's really, I don't even know that it's because it's needed, because we all know that there is a strong and vibrant business case for diversity and inclusion, but I think it's just sort of a must-have. It's a given in this day and age when you're doing work, whether it's education, philanthropy, business, et cetera.
Yeah, I think in the higher education context too, if you have some sort of targeted tutoring or counseling or interventions programs, and then you can show corresponding changes in retention rates among students of color, for instance, that can be really valuable, showing that there's sort of a direct correlation between programs that are being offered and results on campus.
Yeah, I will say that I am a person who is obsessed with analytics. So too are my colleagues here at the center. So we are constantly measuring the impact of the policies and programs and so on that we are helping organizations and institutions implement. I think it's really important to do that. I'm also a professor in a business school. So KPIs, key performance indicators, are my love language. And I think it's really important for folks to start with KPIs and to rigorously track them, and to be transparent about where we are or aren't in our pursuit of their actualization. That's important. I also think that data matter, right? Our center is the birthplace and home of the National Assessment of Collegiate Campus Climates. It's a suite of quantitative surveys that help us understand how students, faculty, and staff across all groups, including white folks, are experiencing the racial climate at their institutions. One way to determine if we're having an impact or if DEI efforts and other efforts are having an impact, compare your 2 years ago NAC data to your 2025 NAC data. Are we seeing a change in what students, faculty, and staff are reporting? The student survey has been administered to 2.5 million undergraduates. Those 2.5 million undergraduates have told us a whole lot about what's happening on their campuses. So, change is trackable from one year to the next, and certainly over 3 years, 5 years, 10 years.
Well, we are going to move to closing comments in a moment. I am going to get one last question in from our Q&A, and I've been given permission to go 5 minutes over, if that's okay with our panelists, just to round out our conversation. This has been truly both meaningful and insightful. There's a question, I'm going to combine two with some moderator privilege, so to speak. One is around anti-DEI efforts coming from within our own institutions. So I don't know if that's something we've perhaps touched on, but not explicitly addressed, right? And that might be within a large organization or small. So thinking about the constituents or perspectives, stakeholders within an organization itself, especially when that backlash is coming from within. And the other question would be, I guess, on a community level. So that's the inside question. Then the outside half would be on a community level. This could be a whole hour-long discussion, but just throwing it out there to be thinking about what does this look like for children and their families and those who kind of make up the fabric of our communities in terms of what children are learning in K-12, as well as just the relationships, community groups that people are part of, in their lives outside of work.
If I can just jump in real quickly on the challenges coming from within, I'm thinking of Indiana University, where the law that was set up in Indiana allows and in fact encourages students to basically turn on their professors if they feel that they are trying to indoctrinate them or aren't being sufficiently broad in the viewpoints they're offering. And that's created a lot of sort of fear and mistrust, the idea that students are going to be turning in their professors if they feel that they're not adhering to this law. So, I think we may be seeing a little bit more of that fear on some college campuses with these really draconian laws.
Thanks, Katie.
Yeah, as an Indiana University alum, that is incredibly disappointing to me that is the reality there at my alma mater. A colleague and I recently published a book with Harvard Education Press titled The Big Lie About Race in America's Schools. And it is inclusive of K-12 and higher ed. I think that I'm taking the communities part of the question, right?
Right.
I think we have to name the big lie in its totality and help the people realize that they have been lied to and that they are being duped by Christopher Rufo and others, right? People have been named in our time together here today. Obviously the title of our book is, it very much is a play on the big lie that the 2020 presidential election was stolen and that Joe Biden was in fact not elected. We know that is a lie that has been repeatedly refuted. So I think that what we have to do in the education space is also help folks understand that January 6th ain't the only sort of way that these big lies show up. They show up every day in your social media feed, on Fox News Channel, and in other places where you're being duped into believing that kids are being groomed and all of these ridiculous things that are not happening. And then we have to help folks understand how to then use truth and evidence and facts to refute those lies in their churches and mosques and synagogues and in their community organizations and groups and in their conversations with their next door neighbors.
That's right. Thanks, Shaun. Well, as we close out this space, I'd love to have everyone share some final reflections or words. I think I'm going to go in the same round table. order. So not to put you on the spot, but Katie, I'd love to hear, as we close out what's been a really powerful discussion, anything on your mind, that you want to pop into the conversation, or also that comes to mind, and again, continuing to sustain the efforts that we're talking about.
Thanks, Erica. Well, it's a pleasure being part of this conversation. I really have learned a lot. The Chronicle is just going to continue to monitor. It might not be so much a matter of new laws coming up, although those might happen, but I think it's really going to be a matter of looking at the impact, like what is going to be the fallout of all of these changes that are taking place, and what are we going to see in terms of student recruitment and retention, and faculty recruitment and retention, and what are going to be the unintended and probably intended consequences of all of these changes taking place. So, that's something that we're just going to be continuing to monitor over the coming year, just to see how it all plays out.
Shaun?
Yeah, listen, this work is incredibly hard, and I understand that these are incredibly distressing times, but as is the case always for me, I feel hopeful and optimistic. So I'm going to encourage others to also lean into hope and optimism, and to do all you can from your respective spheres of influence to help advance our democracy, to help advance its educational institutions, and to help advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in workplaces and everywhere else in our communities, but to do it from a standpoint of hope, and to do it alongside other committed Americans who really care about our democracy.
Thank you. And just a note, folks in the chat are very curious to learn more about the defense tables that you described. So certainly look forward to sharing those resources with our audience as those efforts unfold. Ayana.
So as I think about closing thoughts, two words come to mind for me. The first is agility, and the second is innovation. And I think as leaders, we have to be agile. We have to anticipate change, be prepared for it, because it's the only constant. We know this world is changing, but we also have to innovate. And when we are in situations like we are today, where the very fabric of America is under attack, we have to find new ways of doing things, new ways of being. And so my message would be, yes, on the one hand, there is some business as usual, but on the other hand, there is the incredible work around innovation that needs to happen, because just because, there are some naysayers or those that are anti-DEI that would say, throw it all away, we've got to stay fortified in doing the work, but making sure the work is having the impact that we want it to have. And in cases where it's not, we've got to be innovative to find other ways. So that would just be the message that I would want to leave the audience with today.
Excellent. Thank you, John.
Thanks so much to everybody. And I would really just echo my fellow panelists. I just wanted to raise up one of the questions we didn't get to from Nia or Naya Evans. I'm sorry for the mispronunciation one or the other way. I got it wrong, or maybe I got it wrong twice, but noting that larger organizations may have more privilege, as we do at MacArthur or others, and smaller organizations may have a harder time. And I hope that one thing we might convey, unfortunately, MacArthur cannot fund every small organization in the world. That's not something we can do directly. But we and others really have been giving a lot of thought to how do we support systems, lawyers, committees, and others that would provide that kind of support. I suspect Ayana has thoughts about how the field has rallied around Fearless Fund as they have come under attack, and others. So I do think that to smaller organizations out there, I do hope you will grab onto Shaun's hope, stay the course, and then also be reaching out for the kinds of resources that larger organizations can also provide, and not to despair. And I think that this focus on do what's in your span of control. You know, each of us has a different ability to, some of us get chosen to speak on here, we get to say more, others are in the chat. You know, we all have neighbors, we all have family members, we all can vote if you happen to be able to vote. I guess not all can vote in America, but anyway, many of us can vote, we ought to do it. And just knowing, I think, that there are others out there who are supporting this vision, and if within your span of control, within an organization, whether it's a big university or otherwise, you're not getting the support, I think also knowing that there are other institutions that do share these values and that are hiring and, you know, want you. And so I think there probably does come a time also when what you're trying to do within your span of control isn't consistent with your values. You know, of course, easier said than done, but I do hope that there's opportunity out there as there are many leaders represented here and elsewhere. So keep hope alive, stay the course, and thank you for having us for sure.
Thank you. Well, let me take that opportunity to thank all of you so much, all four of you, Ayana, John, Katie, and Shaun. It has been so meaningful for me, and I know for our audience at large, to be in the company of this conversation. You four are all truly esteemed leaders in your own right, across sectors, across roles, and combined an extraordinary number of years of experience. So grateful for this conversation and your time in joining us. And I just have to note, you know, the holiday of Sukkot starts tonight, and the theme of it, it's a harvest holiday. It's all about building a canopy. And paraphrasing a little here, it reminds me also of Michael McAfee at Policy Link's words of building, you know, a canopy, so to speak, for all of us to thrive under. So what does it look like to see the humanity of everyone in the organization, in our communities, particularly those of us who have been exploited, marginalized, pushed out, dismissed, even killed by or within organizations or in society. And so as we think about building that canopy of both diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also justice, and also creating lives of full dignity that can thrive. So grateful to all of you, and what was a really lively chat as well. Please keep the chat going. As we transition into our break right now, we will come back together at 3:30 Eastern, and you can translate that to your own time zones for our keynote address from Attorney General Andrea Campbell, which should certainly be a welcome continuation of our conversation this afternoon. Thank you so much again, Ayana, Katie, John, and Shaun, and to our audience for joining in.